This is the lesson for 4-7, graphing non-linear functions. Now, the word's non-linear, all right? Non-linear means not a line, all right? Not a line. You are not graphing lines today. What you are doing is you are graphing U-shaped graphs and you are graphing V-shaped graphs. All of the graphs that you've graphed up to this point have all been linear. Today, what you're doing is you are graphing non-linear. Now, linear meant that it graphed a straight line, whether the graph of the line went up or whether the graph of the line went down. All of those were lines, straight lines. On your quiz, you need to know the difference between linear and non-linear. Linear equations look like this. Linear equations look like y equals 2x plus 1, or y equals negative 3x minus 2, or y equals 1/2 x plus 1. All right, those are all linear graphs. All of those, if we graphed them, they would form a straight line. What makes a U-shaped graph or what makes a V-shaped graph is a little bit different. What makes a U-shaped graph is an x squared in the equation. So we might have something like y equals x squared plus 1. Anytime that you have that x squared, it is going to be a U-shaped graph. Now, in your U-shaped graph, it might look like the normal letter U, or it might be an upside down U as well. When you go to graph these today, make sure that you put arrows on the ends of your U's. Excuse me. What makes a V-shaped graph is when you have the absolute value symbol in an equation. So maybe we have something like the absolute value of x plus 2. That absolute value symbol makes it a V-shaped graph. Now, just like the U-shaped graphs, how those can be upside down, your V-shaped graphs could be upside down as well. Also, just like your U-shaped graphs, make sure that you put arrows on the ends. If you don't put arrows on the ends, you will lose credit on the quiz. All right. So again, on the quiz, I am going to be giving you an equation. You have to tell me whether it's linear or non-linear. It is non-linear when it has the x squared or the absolute value. If you don't see an x squared, if you don't see an absolute value, it has to be linear. So now we're actually going to graph these non-linear, but you have to remember a couple things because we are going to use the table method, all right, the chart method to graph these. So there's going to be a couple things that you're going to have to figure out within the chart when you go to solve. First of all, if we have something like 2x squared, what that really means is 2 times x squared. That 2 next to the x means times. So 2 times x squared. When you go to do this, you have to make sure that you follow order of operations, PEMDAS. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, however you learned it. You have to make sure that you're doing the E first. The E stands for exponents. You have to do the exponents before you multiply or divide, before you add or subtract. So please make sure that you're always doing your exponents first. In your chart or in your table, you're going to end up with calculations that you have to do like this. 2 times 3 squared. Now, we have to do the 3 squared part first. Now, it's been a while since we've used exponents. Remember that on your calculator, or on a lot of calculators, there is an x squared button. So if you have an x squared button on your calculator, you might just be able to type in 3 and then hit that x squared button for it to write on your calculator 3 squared. All right. So you might have an x squared button, But if you don't have an x squared button, you might have a caret button to do your exponent. So 3 caret button 2. That will also type in 3 squared on your calculator. So depending on what calculator you're using, you might do it a little bit differently. You can type in this whole thing into the calculator all at once. Calculators are smart. Calculators do order of operations for you. So 2 times 3 squared. If you're doing it in your head without a calculator, you have to follow order of operations. So we have to do the 3 squared first. 3 squared is 3 times 3, which is 9. 9 times 2 is 18. But again, you should be able to type this right into the calculator exactly how it looks and get 18 as well. In the middle one, 3 times 2 squared minus 1. Remember, we have to do the exponent first. So we have to do the 2 squared first. 2 squared is 2 times 2, which is 4. Then we have to do the multiplying. So 3 times 4 is 12. Then we do the subtracting. 12 minus 1 is 11. If you have a 3 squared plus 1, again, you have to do the 3 squared first. 3 squared is 3 times 3, which is 9, plus 1 is 10. Always make sure you do the exponents first. Again, remember, an x squared in the equation will create a U-shaped graph. That U-shaped graph is called a parabola. You'll be dealing with a lot more parabolas in 9th grade math. But for today, you just need to know that you are going to get a U-shaped graph whenever you have an x squared. None of the graphs that you graph today should be a straight line. If you get a straight line, you did something way, way, way wrong. It should be a nice U shape or a nice V-shaped graph today. Let's take a look at absolute value. All right. This is the symbol for absolute value. The absolute value symbol is just 2 straight up and down lines. And then you're going to have something in the middle of it. All right. In between those up and down lines. Now, the bad thing about absolute value is most calculators do not have an absolute value symbol on the calculator. If you're using a really fancy calculator, you might see something that says ABS, and then you have to type in a number after it. But most calculators do not have an absolute value function. All right. So just be aware of that. So what you're going to do, how do you find the absolute value in your head? All right. This is super important. Make sure you're paying attention right now because half of your questions deal with absolute value today. What the absolute value is it is the number of places that a number is away from 0 on the number line. Basically, what you're doing is you are making whatever's inside those 2 straight up and down lines positive. All right. You're making whatever is inside the 2 straight up and down lines positive. So the absolute value of 3. How far away is 3 from 0 on the number line? Well, 3 is 3 spaces away from 0 because 2, 1, 0. 3 is 3 spaces away from 3 on the number line. So the absolute value of 3 is 3. You're just taking whatever's inside those 2 straight up and down lines and making it positive. If it is positive already, you're just going to keep it positive. So the absolute value of 1 is 1. The absolute value of 2 is 2. The absolute value of 3 is 3. The absolute value of 5 is 5. The absolute value of 10 is 10, and so on and so forth. If you have a negative number inside the absolute value symbol, take whatever's inside of there and make it positive. So the absolute value of -3 is also 3 because -3 is 3 spaces away from 0 on the number line. -2, -1, 0. 3 is 3 spaces away. The absolute value of -1 is 1. The absolute value of -2 is 2. The absolute value of -5 is 5. The absolute value of -10 is 10. So just take whatever's inside those two straight up and down lines and make it positive. Now you have to be careful of one thing. On some of the questions today, you will have an operation, whether it's adding, subtracting, multiplying, or dividing, inside of the absolute value symbol. Whenever you have an whenever you have an operation inside the absolute value symbol, you have to do that operation first. So we're going to do the 2 plus -3 first. 2 plus -3 is -1. Then take the absolute value of -1. The absolute value of -1 is +1. So anytime you have an operation inside, you want to do that first. So in this one, we want to do the -2 times 3 first. -2 times 3 is -6. Then take the absolute value of -6, which is +6. So again, be very, very careful there. Anytime that you see this absolute value symbol in your equation, it's going to create a V-shaped graph. Again, sometimes it might be a V, sometimes it might be an upside down V. It all depends. So let's take a look at our first example. We're going to do 2 of each of these. All right, we're going to do 2 of each of these. So now there's a lot of little parts and pieces in this. So just like when we were using the chart method before, you're going to take your X values and you're going to sub them in for X. So when we go to sub these in, instead of having X squared, I'm going to have -2 squared. Instead of having X squared, I'm going to have -1 squared. Instead of X squared, I'm going to have 0 squared. Instead of X squared, I'm going to have 1 squared. And instead of X squared, I'm going to have 2 squared. Now, this might be the most important thing that I say today, so make sure you're paying attention. When you go to do your squareds, if you go to type this into the calculator, you have to put parentheses around your negative numbers in the calculator. If you don't put parentheses around your negative numbers in the calculator, you will get those wrong every single time because the calculator will read it differently. The calculator will see that negative sign as really being -1 times 2 squared, where we really want -2 squared. So make sure that anytime that you have negatives, you put parentheses in your calculator. Now we need to put the -3s at the end. Just like before, you're going to put whatever your answer is in your Y column. So I'm just going to put equal signs here. So you can type this right into your calculator exactly how it is with the with the parentheses. If you don't put parentheses, going to get it wrong. If you go to do it in your head, -2 squared is -2 times -2, which is +4. 4 minus 3 is 1. We put our answer in that Y column. -1 squared. -1 times -1 is +1. 1 minus 3 is -2. 0 squared. 0 times 0 is 0. Minus 3 is -3. 1 squared is 1 times 1, which is 1. Minus 3 is -2. 2 squared is 2 times 2, which is 4. Minus 3 is 1. Now, take a look at your Y column for a second. Take a look at the Y column. Do you see any pattern that is there in our answers? Take a look at the Y column. Do you see any pattern that's there? You should. Take a look at our first and our last number in our column. Notice that that first and last number are the same. Take a look at our second number and our fourth number. Notice that those are the same. That is always going to happen. Now, why is that always going to happen? This is going to be a U-shaped graph. Well, this number in the middle is going to be the bottom part of our U. But then to make a perfectly symmetrical letter U, where it looks the same on both sides, we need numbers that are opposite of each other. We need numbers that are opposite each other to form that perfectly symmetrical U. So in your table, that first number and fifth number are going to be the same for 2 and -2. That second and fourth number for 1 and -1 are going to be the same as well. That is always going to happen. When we go to graph our points, your X value is how many we go over. Your Y value is how many we go up or down. Remember, when we graph points, we always start right here in the middle. That's where we start counting from. So the point -2, 1. Starting in the middle, we're going over to -2, up to +1. There's our first dot. -1, -2. Over to -1, down to -2. 0, -3. Starting in the middle, over 0, down to -3. 1, -2. Starting in the middle, over to 1, down to -2. And 2, 1. Starting in the middle, over to 2, up to 1. Notice how this is perfectly symmetrical. Now, some people might look at it and say, hey, that looks like a V, not a U. Trust me, anytime that you have that X squared, it is a U. I will show you the difference between a U and a V once we graph the V shape. So connect the dots. Always make sure that you put arrows on the ends. If you don't put arrows, you will lose points when you graph it. You should also always label your U-shaped or your V-shaped graph. So that is one complete question there. Let's do another one. Take a look at this one. Now, this one is a little bit more difficult. This one says 2x squared minus 2. So this is really 2 times x squared minus 2. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to take our x values. Whoever left, I would not suggest leaving. All right. We still have absolute value ones to graph, which are very different. So we're going to take those x values and sub them in for x. So instead of 2 times x squared, we're going to have 2 times -2 squared. Instead of 2 times x squared, we're going to have 2 times -1 squared. Instead of 2 times x squared, we're going to have 2 times 0 squared. Instead of 2 times x squared, we're going to have 2 times 1 squared. Instead of 2 times x squared, we're going to have 2 times 2 squared. Don't forget about your -2's at the end. Now, you can take these and type these right into the calculator exactly how they look and put your answer in this y or f of x column. Be very careful. Again, if you go to type these into the calculator, you have to put parentheses around your negative numbers, around that -2 and around that -1. If you don't put parentheses, you will get every single one wrong. So -2 squared is -2 times -2, which is +4. 2 times 4 is 8. 8 minus 2 is 6. It's a lot easier to type that right into the calculator. -1 squared is -1 times -1, which is +1. 2 times 1 is 2. -2 is 0. 0 squared is 0 times 0, which is 0. 2 times 0 is 0. -2 is -2. 1 squared is 1 times 1, which is 1. 2 times 1 is 2. -2 is 0. 2 squared is 2 times 2, which is 4. Times 2, which is 8. -2, which is 6. Again, notice our first number and our last number are the same. That is always going to happen. Our second number and our fourth number are the same. That is always going to happen. When you go to graph it, your first number is how many we go over. Your second number is how many you go up or down. When we go to graph it, you want to start right here, right in the middle. So -2, 6, starting in the middle, over to -2, up to +6. -1, 0, starting in the middle, over to -1, up to 0. 0, -2, starting in the middle, over 0, down to -2. 1, 0, starting in the middle, over to 1, up to 0. And 2, 6, starting in the middle, over to 2, up to 6. Again, sort of looks like a V, but it's not. It's really a U-shaped graph. We're just going to connect our dots like this. Make sure that you put arrows on the ends, otherwise you will lose points. And you should always label your graph. So again, those are two examples where we had x squareds. Those x squareds will make U-shaped graphs. Now, take a look at the absolute value. Absolute value, remember, are going to make V-shaped graphs. All right, it's going to be a perfectly symmetrical V shape. So again, what we want to do is we want to take our x values and sub them in for x. So instead of having 2 times x, we're going to have 2 times -2, 2 times -1, 2 times 0, 2 times 1, and 2 times 2. Now remember, that is the absolute value of that operation. So we need to do the operation first in the red and then take the absolute value of that. After we do that, we have to add 1 to it because we have the +1 in our equation. So the absolute value, 2 times -2. 2 times -2 is -4. The absolute value of -4 is +4. 4 plus 1 is 5. 2 times -1 is -2. The absolute value of -2 is +2. 2 plus 1 is 3. 2 times 0 is 0. The absolute value of 0 is 0. Plus 1 is 1. 2 times 1 is 2. The absolute value of 2 is 2. 2 plus 1 is 3. 2 times 2 is 4. The absolute value of 4 is 4. Plus 1 is 5. Notice what happened again. Our first number, our last number are the same. The second number and the fourth number are the same. That is always going to happen because, again, this middle number is the bottom dot in our V, or if it's upside down, the top dot. And then we have to have equally spaced dots on both sides of the V to get that perfect V shape. So when we go to graph it, starting in the middle, over to -2, up to +5. Starting in the middle, over to -1, up to +3. Starting in the middle, over 0, up to 1. Starting in the middle, over to 1, up to 3. And starting in the middle, over to 2, up to 5. Notice how these in the V are perfectly equally distanced. There's like 2 in between, 2 in between, 2 in between, 2 in between. That's what's going to make that perfect V shape, as opposed to the U shape where you had like 6 in between and 2 in between. Now these ones are equally spaced. That's how I know this is a V and not a U. Again, just like your U-shaped graph, make sure that you put arrows on the ends of your V, and you should label it as well. Let's take a look at one more. Take your X values and sub them in for X. So instead of the absolute value of X, we have the absolute value of -2. the absolute value of -1, the absolute value of 0, the absolute value of 1, and the absolute value of 2. Don't forget your plus 4 in our equation. The absolute value of -2 is +2. 2 plus 4 is 6. Absolute value of -1 is +1. 1 plus 4 is 5. Absolute value of 0 is 0. Plus 4 is 4. Absolute value of 1 is 1. Plus 4 is 5. Absolute value of 2 is 2. Plus 4 is 6. Again, notice that our first number and our last number are the same. The second number and the fifth number are the same. Again, that will always happen. Your X value is how many you go over. Your Y value is how many you go up or down. When we go to graph it, we always start from graphing right in the middle. -2, 6, starting in the middle, over to 2, up to 6. -1, 5, over to -1, up to +5. 0, 4, over 0, up to 4. Over to 1, up to 5. Over to 2, up to 6. Notice how I have my perfectly symmetrical V shape. Put arrows on the ends and label your equation. Again, you should not be graphing any straight lines at all today. They should either be a U shape or a V shaped graph.